They say some souls are forged, not born. Not in comfort, but in chaos, in homes where love was conditional, silence was heavy, and peace was a performance. Before you ever knew the meaning of empathy, your body was already practicing it. You learned that emotions could shift a room like weather. You could sense when a storm was coming, not in the sky, but in someone's eyes. While other children colored on walls or ran through the yard, you were studying micro-expressions, decoding tones, memorizing the footsteps in the hallway. You became fluent in tension, bilingual in chaos. And you didn't call it fear, you called it normal. But here's the secret Jung never put in a quote. No one becomes an empath because everything was fine. Sensitivity, at its origin, is a form of intelligence born from danger. It's how the body learns to survive the unpredictable, by turning perception into armor. You weren't just feeling too much. You were detecting. Your nervous system became an instrument of precision, tuned to frequencies others could never hear. Every argument, every slammed door, every unfinished apology left a vibration in you, and somehow you learned to translate it into meaning. You became the peacekeeper, the reader, the one who knew when to stay quiet and when to smile to stop a storm. That's how a sensitive soul begins its training. Not in serenity, but in survival. And yet, no one called that a gift. They called it too emotional, too intense, too much. Carl Jung once said that the greatest wounds of childhood become the foundations of the personality. He was describing this exact paradox, that what breaks you first becomes what defines you most. The empath's gift begins as a defense, a nervous system tuned to chaos, reading signals before they turn into storms. It's not intuition, not yet. It's vigilance disguised as compassion, a form of love learned through self-erasure. You learn to keep the peace by disappearing into it. Imagine a small child standing before a burning house, not running, not screaming, just watching the flames in silence. That's the psyche of the empath in its origin story, transfixed by destruction, learning to find meaning in smoke. The child doesn't yet know that they are witnessing their own metaphor, that every spark in that fire will later appear as sensitivity, intuition, creativity, all of it born from chaos. Somewhere in that moment, the mind makes a vow. If I can understand it, maybe it won't hurt so much. That vow becomes the blueprint of empathy, a quiet obsession with decoding the world. And though it looks like love, it's built on fear, the fear of not seeing the next fire coming. That's why even as adults, many empaths still flinch at sudden tones, still sense invisible shifts in a room, still feel the pull to fix what they didn't break. Because deep inside, there's still that child standing in front of the burning house, small, silent, and awake, trying to find safety in understanding. What the world now calls a gifted soul was once just a child trying to make sense of the flames. And no matter how far you travel from that home, that image remains within you. The light cutting through the smoke, the walls collapsing, and you, learning that your sensitivity was never weakness. It was evidence, proof that you survived what should have shattered you. And maybe, that's where the story of your strength truly begins. When a child grows up in chaos, the world stops being a playground and becomes a system to decode. Every tone of voice becomes a signal. Every silence becomes a warning. Every shift in mood becomes data to analyze. And before the child can spell their own name, they've already become fluent in the unspoken language of instability. This is how the body learns before the mind catches up. It turns empathy into vigilance, and vigilance into survival. It's not that the child chooses to feel deeply. It's that they have to, because the cost of missing an emotional cue might be pain, shame, or sudden rejection. In a way, the empath's perception is not a gift granted by nature, but a response calibrated by necessity. Carl Jung believed that early chaos imprints the psyche with living symbols of survival. These symbols, fear, control, hyper-awareness, become the scaffolding for the adult personality. What others see as intuition is often just pattern recognition refined by trauma. It's the same principle the neuroscientists at Harvard's Center for the Developing Child discovered in their longitudinal studies on early adversity. Children exposed to unpredictable caregiving develop heightened activation in the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, while their prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for regulation and reflection, adapts to compensate, becoming more responsive but also more fatigued over time. In simpler terms, the brain becomes both sharper and more fragile, a brilliant instrument built in a storm. Researchers have a term for this paradox: neuroplastic hyperadaptation. It's the mind's desperate genius, the ability to rewire itself in the middle of chaos just to keep functioning. The cost, however, is subtle but immense. The person grows up believing that emotional prediction equals safety, and that peace is just a prelude to the next explosion. That's why empaths don't just feel, they forecast. They walk into a room and instinctively sense where tension is hiding. They can detect hostility masked by politeness, sorrow beneath control, the faintest dissonance in a conversation that everyone else calls normal. Their perception operates like a sonar, scanning for the tremor beneath the calm. From a neuroscientific perspective, this heightened sensitivity is a masterpiece of adaptation. From a psychological one, it's a lifelong inheritance of pain. The very organ that evolved to protect them from chaos now makes them unable to rest within peace. Jung wrote that the child who adapts too early becomes the adult who cannot stop perceiving. That's the empath's paradox. What once saved them now traps them. And yet, in that same paradox, something extraordinary emerges: awareness. Because when sensitivity evolves from reaction into observation, when pain transforms into understanding, the echo becomes revelation. The empath begins to realize that what they hear beneath people's words isn't merely emotion, it's pattern. They start to see repetition, how anger always masks fear, how arrogance is a disguise for shame, how distance is sometimes the body's way of protecting a wound too deep to touch. Their gift becomes not the ability to feel more, but to see through. In that sense, the empath is both scientist and poet of the emotional world, decoding invisible data with the same intensity a physicist studies light. Every sigh, every micro-expression, every tremor of tone becomes a clue in the mystery of human suffering. They read people like weather systems, forecasting emotional storms long before the first drop of rain. But this extraordinary perception carries a hidden risk: the inability to tell where others end and they begin. Because when you live inside everyone else's echo, your own voice becomes a whisper. That's why so many sensitive souls, even in calm environments, feel restless, anxious, or on the edge of something unnamed. It's not intuition gone wrong. It's an echo that never found silence. The truth is, chaos doesn't just shape perception. It invents it. It turns the nervous system into a living antenna, sensitive enough to detect pain across the room, but also fragile enough to absorb it. And until awareness turns that adaptation into wisdom, the echo continues, bouncing between past and present, memory and empathy, self and other. So the next time you walk into a room and instantly feel what no one has said, remember, you're not imagining it. You're remembering it. It's not new energy. It's the resonance of an old survival skill, polished by years of decoding storms. What once kept you alive has now made you extraordinary. And yet, the very depth that connects you to others is also what demands that you finally learn to connect back to yourself. Every family, no matter how polished its surface, carries a shadow, a silent archive of everything that has been suppressed, denied, or disguised. It doesn't appear in the photo albums or the family stories told at dinner. It hides in the pauses between words, in the tension at reunions, in the inherited phrases that sound like love but taste like control. And someone, inevitably, is chosen to feel it, to carry what the others refuse to see. Carl Jung called this phenomenon the family shadow, the collective portion of the unconscious that extends beyond one generation. He observed that what remains integrated in the parents inevitably seeks expression in the children. If the father represses anger, the son may carry rage without knowing why. If the mother hides her sadness behind perfection, the daughter may grow up allergic to failure yet haunted by invisible sorrow. The family system functions like an ecosystem of emotions. When one part refuses to hold pain, another part absorbs it. Modern science has found startling evidence for this ancient intuition. Research in epigenetics, particularly studies from Mount Sinai and the University of Zurich, has shown that emotional trauma can alter the way genes express themselves, leaving molecular bookmarks that are passed down through generations. Children of war survivors, for example, exhibit heightened cortisol responses and altered stress regulation patterns, even when raised in peaceful environments. The body, in other words, keeps not only your score, but your family's as well. It's as if the psyche and the DNA collaborate in silence to preserve what consciousness cannot bear. For the empath, this inheritance becomes a calling they never agreed to answer. They become the emotional translator of the lineage, sensing ancestral grief, decoding patterns of shame, intuitively trying to heal what began long before they were born. It's not imagination, it's systemic resonance. They are the nervous system of the family made visible. In many households, the empath is the identified feeler, the one who cries when others stay composed, who asks questions no one wants to answer, who senses tension that everyone insists doesn't exist. They become the mirror of the family's hidden face. And mirrors, as Jung reminded us, are rarely welcomed at first glance. This is why, in toxic families, the most sensitive child often becomes the scapegoat. They disturb the equilibrium of denial. Their perception exposes what others have spent decades avoiding, so the family projects its discomfort back onto them. You're too dramatic. You overthink everything. You're the problem. But beneath that accusation lies an unconscious plea. Please stop showing us what we can't face. Jung wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." He meant that unresolved desires, fears, and guilt don't simply vanish. They flow downward, searching for a vessel. The empath becomes that vessel, not because they are weak, but because their sensitivity allows them to register the frequencies others block out. They feel the grief of generations, the weight of silence, the ache of things unsaid. And for a time, they mistake it for their own pain. It's a haunting inheritance, to be born into a story still being written, yet expected to make it make sense. But within that burden lies an extraordinary potential, the chance to end the repetition. Because awareness, once awakened, interrupts transmission. The moment an empath stops asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begins to wonder, "What did I absorb that was never mine?" the spell breaks. The family shadow loses its carrier. Psychologically, this is the first act of individuation, the process Jung described as the soul's separation from collective patterns. It is the act of turning the inherited mirror into a window, of seeing the family not as destiny but as context. The empath who does this doesn't betray the family, they redeem it. They transmute emotional inheritance into consciousness, pain into pattern, chaos into meaning. Because in every generation there's one who doesn't fit, the one who asks, feels, remembers. And though they may be called too much, they are, in truth, the beginning of something new. They are the evolutionary leap of the lineage, the point where survival becomes awareness. Every story of sensitivity begins in pain, but not every story of pain ends in suffering. For the empath, what once felt like a curse eventually becomes a compass, a strange, almost mystical form of guidance born not from privilege, but from endurance. And to understand how that transformation happens, We must return to the very place where it began, the family shadow. Because once you stop carrying what isn't yours, once you see the patterns you were never meant to hold, something remarkable happens inside you. The nervous system, once chained to reaction, begins to find rhythm and awareness. The chaos that once hijacked your perception starts to reveal its hidden architecture. You begin to see that pain, when fully faced, is not a wound, it's a map. Carl Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And nowhere is that more evident than in the empath who learns to interpret their sensitivity not as fragility, but as intelligence. The same neural pathways that once scanned for threat now detect nuance, depth, and energy, the language of the unseen. And neuroscience confirms this evolution. Researchers at the University of Wisconsin found that people with higher emotional reactivity in childhood develop increased connectivity between the insular and prefrontal cortex, regions responsible for empathy, awareness, and moral reasoning. In other words, the empath's brain doesn't just heal, it adapts forward, transforming the reflex of protection into the capacity for profound understanding. It's the mind's alchemy, pain transmuted into perception. The body that once trembled at chaos now reads patterns in it. What once overwhelmed becomes data. What once triggered becomes teaching. And the same radar that was built to detect danger begins to detect truth. This is where intuition is born, not as a mystical gift from nowhere, but as the refinement of a survival mechanism. Intuition is simply emotion remembered accurately. It's the residue of experiences encoded so deeply in the nervous system that they bypass language and appear as knowing. When an empath says, "I just feel it," they are describing the sum of 1,000 remembered vibrations, reorganized into instant recognition. But here's what makes it miraculous. This capacity doesn't only belong to pain, it's shaped by meaning. When awareness enters the pattern, perception becomes wisdom. That's the crucial turning point, when the empath stops interpreting their sensitivity as a liability and starts using it as a lens. They move from absorption to observation, from drowning in feelings to navigating through them. Jung called this the transcendent function, the moment when opposites within the psyche, once at war, begin to communicate. The empath learns that the same intensity that once caused suffering now grants access to subtle realms of understanding, art, healing, teaching, creativity. They begin to perceive emotion as energy, and energy as language. Their empathy evolves into intuition, not reactive, but responsive, not chaotic, but coherent. Imagine again the child from before, standing before the burning house, transfixed by the fire. Now, years later, they return to that same vision, but something has changed. They no longer fear the flames. They recognize their rhythm. They understand that the fire is not an enemy, but a signal, a metaphor for transformation. The same heat that once consumed can now illuminate. This is the essence of emotional evolution. Awareness doesn't erase the past, it integrates it. The empath doesn't stop feeling, they start seeing. They realize that every tear they once shed was teaching their nervous system to recognize frequencies of truth. That every moment of confusion was building an inner compass capable of navigating ambiguity and complexity, the exact traits required for deep perception and compassion. And so the pattern completes its first arc. The trauma that once fractured identity becomes the very ground on which the self stands. The empath, once the mirror of the family's pain, becomes its interpreter, the one who sees clearly what generations before could not. It's not survival anymore, it's synthesis. Not endurance, but meaning. Because intuition, in its highest form, is consciousness remembering its own resilience. And for the empath, that realization is liberation, the moment they understand that what was once inherited as pain has now become their most refined form of perception. The wound has turned into wisdom. The fire has become light. But every light casts a shadow. And even the most awakened empath can mistake illumination for immunity. Because the gift born from pain still remembers the pain, and sometimes it longs for what it knows. After years of decoding chaos, the body begins to crave its rhythm. It confuses calm with emptiness and silence with danger. The empath, now fluent in storms, feels strangely uneasy when the air is still. The absence of conflict feels like loss, as if something vital has gone missing. This is where the pattern quietly reemerges. The mind knows it wants peace, but the nervous system only trusts what it has survived before. And so, without realizing it, the empath starts to orbit familiar energies, the sharp voices, the unpredictable moods, the magnetic pull of someone who feels just a little too much like home. It's not desire, it's recognition, the frequency of the past disguised as love. Carl Jung warned that the psyche repeats what it has not understood. And so, the empath, the one who sees and feels so deeply, becomes trapped in the very vibration they were born to transcend. Drawn toward the wounded, the unavailable, the self-absorbed, not to suffer again, but to repair what was never healed. It's the unconscious hope that this time, love will fix what love once fractured. But the truth is sharper than comfort. Repetition is not redemption. Healing doesn't come from replaying the fire. It comes from stepping outside its circle. Because until the empath recognizes that their sensitivity was meant for awareness, not for rescue, the pattern continues, quietly, elegantly, painfully. The true danger is not in feeling too much, but in feeling for the wrong reasons. And the first sign of awakening is that sacred pause. The moment you sense the echo, recognize its rhythm, and decide not to dance to it anymore. Healing begins the moment awareness interrupts instinct. When the empath, standing before the familiar pull of chaos, finally pauses, not to analyze, not to fix, but simply to see. That pause is sacred. It's the birth of consciousness, the instant Jung called the beginning of individuation, when the soul steps out of the inherited story and starts to write its own. At first, it feels like emptiness. Without chaos to decode, who am I? Without someone to rescue, what do I do with my empathy? But beneath that stillness lies something new, choice. The empath learns to sit with quiet, to let discomfort pass without translating it into action. They begin to separate compassion from compulsion, connection from caretaking. And in that separation, clarity appears, the realization that peace doesn't mean absence of feeling, it means presence without reaction. This is the true alchemy of awareness, the moment when perception turns inward, and the light once used to read others begins to illuminate the self. In the end, every empath must return to the fire, not to be burned again, but to understand the light that once terrified them. Because healing isn't escape, it's recognition. It's the moment when you look at what once consumed you and realize it no longer defines you. The child who once stood before the burning house has grown. They no longer see destruction, they see transformation. The flames are still there, but so is awareness. And through that awareness, the fire loses its power to wound. Jung believed that true individuation occurs when the conscious and the unconscious finally meet as equals, when what was feared is no longer exiled, but integrated. That's what this return means. You no longer run from your sensitivity, nor weaponize it to earn love. You simply inhabit it. You stand inside your own perception and call it home. The echoes of the past still whisper, but they no longer dictate. The inherited shadows still exist, but now they move with rhythm, not resistance. You see the pattern, but you're no longer bound to repeat it. You feel deeply, but without dissolving. You sense everything, yet remain whole. And perhaps that's what being born from chaos truly means. Not that you escaped the fire, but that you became light because of it. Your empathy is no longer a wound, it's awareness. Your sensitivity is no longer your defense, it's your wisdom. You were never too much. You were simply the one who stayed awake while everyone else slept through the storm. So when the world feels heavy again, and you sense the old echo rising, remember this. You've walked through fire before, and what survived the flames was never your pain, but your perception. The chaos that once made you tremble is now your teacher, and what was once broken has finally learned how to see. If this spoke to your soul, it's because a part of you remembers the fire and what it taught you about light. You were never fragile for feeling deeply. You were simply built to see what others overlook. So if this journey resonated with your own, share it below. Your story might be the mirror someone else needs to finally understand theirs. And if you're walking this path of awareness, learning to turn pain into perception, silence into understanding, stay with us. This space was made for minds like yours. Because here, every shadow has meaning, and every soul, born from chaos, learns to see.